From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And coming up today, K-State's Dan O'Brien, offering his latest observations on the grain market trends. Among other things, Dan will remark on the surprisingly healthy grain basis levels at local delivery points around Kansas currently. And he'll size up the numbers from that virtual wheat tour this week. Also with us today, K-State's Sarah Lancaster. She'll talk about assessing the in-soil activity of pre-emergence herbicides applied to corn and soybean ground. Sarah looks at the modes of action of the 5 herbicide groups that are commonly used to control weeds before they emerge. And we'll bring in K-State's Mary Knapp for her weekly segment on Kansas agricultural weather. It's all here on Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
This is Agriculture Today. Glad to have you tuned in once again. Well, that virtual hard red wheat tour around Kansas and adjoining states took place this week, put on by Kansas Wheat in cooperation with Kansas State University. The numbers are in, and they lend to our discussion now with Dan O'Brien on the grain markets. Dan is a grain market economist with K-State Research and Extension. So if one looks at the posted yield number as well as the overall production number for the Kansas wheat crop, which was developed from this tour, the figures, Dan, are on the short side of historical standards.
Yes, the projection of the wheat tour was for the Kansas wheat crop in 2020 to be 284.4 million bushels. Now, at this time, we have the May USDA projection to compare that to, and that's around 306 million bushels. So the wheat tour came in and projected a number below that. The actual yield per acre for the USDA for Kansas was 47 bushels per acre. The wheat tour came in at 44.5, but with a lot of geographic variation across the state. And the areas that were low, the lowest one was in southwest Kansas, and that matches up with the drought map, and probably where some freeze damage was too. The tour came in at 32.9 bushels per acre for southwest, followed by north central Kansas at 41.1 bushels per acre, west central 42.5, again, some of the same dry conditions and other damage that southwest had. And then up to northwest Kansas, 51.7. And for the rest of the state, you look at south central, eastern Kansas, 49.5, 47.6, eastern part of the state, 46.5. So a lot of variability. I always wonder about what presumptions the people doing the tour had to make in the field as they were looking at this, and what they were assuming for the rest of the year, and how vulnerable these ongoing dry conditions in parts of the state and the playing out of wheat freeze damage, how that will end up and affect the final numbers. If we have conditions that we've had in some past years where we get to this point of the year and we have wonderful, cool, rainy weather, of course, we're fighting disease during situations like that. But if we have tremendous weather, quote, greenhouse weather, then secondary growth can come in. And even the areas that look rough right now can come in and have great yields. However, that's not here right yet. And the trends, if anything, are particularly in the southwest, west central, and expanding areas are for some drier, tougher conditions. So there's the potential for this number to go either direction. But if you were wondering where the odds are, I would wonder about the yield prospects declining even from where we're at. But that's why wheat is such a great crop for this part of the world. It's so hardy that if you give it any lifeline, it tends to come through pretty well.
So, Dan, what is the market upshot of the numbers from the tour, do you think?
I think it makes a difference what not just Kansas is seeing, but also what all these major western, central, and southern plains hard red winter wheat states are looking at. So the USDA came in for Colorado, projected 61 million bushels. The tour projected 54.2, so about 6-7 million less. The USDA projected Kansas, again, 305.5 to be exact, I think is their number. This the USDA had in the May report released on the 12th. And this tour is coming in at 284.4, so down about 21 million. Nebraska, just about the same, a slight bit higher. Oklahoma, the USDA projected 102.6. Well, the tour came in at 96, so about 6 million bushels lower. Texas, we don't have a tour number for Texas. So if you assume that is right on, although they've got some dry conditions down there at 84 million, you end up with the total for these 5 states, according to the Kansas Wheat Tour numbers, and assuming Texas is right, for the USDA about 561 million bushels, and USDA May report was at 594 or 595. So down 33, down 34. And if either because of lower than expected yields or the harvested acres estimate weakens, you could add another 5 to 10 million bushels less than what the USDA is projected. So you're down at, say, 40 million bushels. 40 million bushels in the U.S. wheat supply-demand balance sheet takes the projected U.S. wheat production for 2020 from about 1.86, 1.87 down to, again, 40 million bushels off of that. You're at 1.82. Ending stocks, everything else unchanged. Instead of 909 million, you're below that. And looking at something closer to 40, 41% stocks to use, 42, thereabouts. And it would be positive for prices. And of course, this is shaving on the margins. The big thing will be what happens in the wheat export market. And, there are issues afoot over in the Black Sea region with their worries and concerns. And so it's a far from certain world market that now has to look at the prospect of U.S. exportable supplies being a bit tighter than what they had been expecting, what the USDA had said, and with the risk that it could tighten up more.
Well, we want to finish up our session on this, Dan, and you track local basis levels for the major grains routinely and post them on the agmanager.info website. But you note this week that corn and grain sorghum basis levels are on quite sound footing in the state, and wheat and soybean basis are holding up very well likewise.
Yes, on the heels of pretty good export news for both corn and grain sorghum, particularly grain sorghum, a 10 million bushel week for the week ending May the 14th. You've got basis levels reflecting for sorghum, for sure, strong movement in sorghum export demand. Here you have looking at, say, Garden City as a representative of the western third of the state, Hutchinson for the central, Columbus, Kansas for the eastern part. You've got the grain sorghum basis running 50 cents at least, 50, 70 cents in the western and central locations, higher than any place it's been since 2016. And even in Columbus, Kansas, you're up about 30 cents over the highest it had been in 2019, 2018 period. So that's strong for sorghum. But what about for corn? For all the weakness in ethanol, a lot of things have been coming into play. Even corn basis bids out in the western part of the state, Garden City, at about 10 under, 5-10 cents stronger than we've seen in the past. Now, in Hutchinson, central part of the state, the second highest we've been last year was stronger, 20 under. We're at about 30 under, but that's higher than any of those other years. And at Atchison, and northeast part of the state, you're at even money at Bartlett Grain. We get that off of our Ag Manager basis tracking. And last year was a little bit stronger, but not by much. But still, that's basis stronger than anywhere we've been. So come back to this issue of looking at the futures and their weakness, and then you look at the cash markets, and some not too bad cash market bids. And just quickly, I know we want to look at wheat too. Hard red winter wheat basis Well, in Garden City, tied for as strong as we've been in the last several years. And of course, that's in Garden City out there in southwest part of the state where things are dry. They're wondering about their wheat crop and generally okay basis in other parts. For soybeans, when you look at where soybean basis is at right now, you're looking at, surprisingly, with just okay export movement, but decent crush, you've got Garden City soybean basis as high, as strong. Of course, it's $1 under, but it's as strong as it's been since 2016. Cargill and Hutchinson, their public bid off of DTN at 50 cents under. That's 20, 30 cents better than any place it's been of late. And even at Bartlett Grain in Atchison, their listed DTN bid for this time of year, they're at about 25 under, and that's 5-10 cents better than anything we've seen the last several years. So what's afoot? How come with prices not being much, we've got such strong basis levels around the state relative to where we've been? Well, on the one hand, it's probably a combination of several things. There's still a demand for these crops. That's on the one hand. And on the other, we've got a futures market that is not inclined to look at very much positively at the moment. So probably a combination of both of those brings you to the place of having pretty decent basis bids in many areas of the state for our major crops.
And the message to the producer is pay attention in as far as marketing opportunity. If you hold to the old adage that basis leads futures, then you're sitting here looking at these signals and wondering, what? What's the deal? How come basis is so strong and the futures are just so? Well, there's some underlying demand there. It's not completely fallen out of bed, and that holds some hope for the future. Very well. Again, Dan's notes in full can be found on agmanager.info. And Dan, good work as always. Many thanks.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Research and Extension grain market economist Dan O'Brien of K-State is along with us each Friday here on the broadcast. And by the way, we will have more specifics on the results of that virtual hard winter wheat tour of Kansas this past week, as those will be featured on the Kansas Wheat Scoop with Marsha Boswell further ahead here on Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, amber alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Next for you on this Agriculture Today, something for you corn and soybean growers who employ pre-emergence herbicides as a part of your weed control program. Is that pre-emerge treatment doing what it's supposed to be doing? Our guest, weed science specialist Sarah Lancaster of K-State Research and Extension, you bring this topic up, Sarah, in the Agronomy E-Update newsletter to be posted later today. You think that there may be just cause for discussing this. Why so?
So there have been a few questions about pre-emergence herbicides this spring, Eric. So some areas have had a lot of cool and wet weather, and so those folks have concerns about injury with these pre-emergent herbicides, but some places haven't had quite as much rain. And if we don't get timely rains after pre-emergence herbicides, those herbicides may not work as well because they don't get where they need to go in the soil.
We can take a look at this by way of the various herbicide groups and their modes of action. And you might walk us through that. That'll give us a better understanding of what should be expected of each of these groups in as far as how they behave in the soil.
Sure, Eric. So when we think about herbicides that are used pre-emergence in corn and soybeans, they basically fall into one of 5 herbicide mode of action groups. So we've been talking a lot about herbicide mode of action groups in the context of weed resistance management. So we'll talk about the pre's in that same schematic there. So the first group to think about is called Group 3. Those are called seedling root growth inhibitors, and Prowl is probably the best example of that. So Incorporation or activation is really important for prowl for a couple of reasons. One, because it needs to be taken in through the plant as it is emerging from the seed. But the other reason that incorporation or activation is so important for prowl is that prowl actually is very volatile. And so if it doesn't get down into the soil, the herbicide will be lost to evaporation. The second group to think about, it would be group 15. These are called seedling shoot growth inhibitors, metolachlor or dual, harness, zidua. Those would all be good examples of herbicides that are in group 15. And again, because these products are taken in through the roots and the shoots as they emerge from the seed, it's important that those herbicides get into the soil to about the zone where the seeds are going to be germinating. So, a good rainfall will do that. So something that's kind of interesting about that group is that even though they all have the same mode of action and have fairly similar properties, there's actually some differences in the recommendations for the amount of rainfall that is required to activate those herbicides. So those recommendations range anywhere from about 1/4 of an inch of rain for harness and other acetochlor-containing products, all the way up through about 1/2 an inch to an inch for metolachlor or dual products. So that is the second group. The third group to think about would be pigment inhibitors. Those are called group 27. Those are the bleaching herbicides, things like Callisto or Balance. Now, these are interesting because they also have a little bit of activity post-emergence. So these are taken up by the root of the plant as it is growing. It can also be taken in by the roots and actually by the seeds as well. So while rainfall is still important to get those products into where they need to be for pre-activity, you can still get some post-emergence activity with those products with a later rain that puts that herbicide into soil solution that the plants can then take up through the roots through the general process of transpiration. So the next group then would be group 5. Those are photosynthesis inhibitors. That's atrazine and metribuzin. And so those are kind of similar to the pigment inhibitors in that they have activity pre-emergence and post-emergence. So as long as that root can take that product up, you'll get some control. The thing that's a little bit different about atrazine is that it inhibits photosynthesis. So that plant has to be carrying out photosynthesis. It actually has to be above the ground before those plants will die. And then the last group there are the cell membrane disruptors, group 14. Sulfentrazone or Valor are good examples of those types of products. And again, incorporation with rainfall is generally a little less significant for those. In fact, with these guys, you have to think a little bit about crop injury with rainfall. If you have excessive rainfall, or maybe let's say you have planted in kind of wet conditions and you don't get good closure of your seed slot, then you might see some crop injury from those.
So we asked you to share all of that in that knowing the groups of herbicides and how they behave out there, their modes of action. That will help a producer have an idea of whether or not they would need to follow up with a secondary post-treatment. In some cases, perhaps, especially when you look at the seedling growth root inhibitors, the shoot growth inhibitors. The others, maybe you wouldn't have to. Is that the interpretation here, Sarah?
Well, scouting is going to be an important part of any weed management program. So, when we think about recommended practices for weed management, pre-emergence herbicides are a key part of that, and then timely scouting. So what you're looking for here are just weeds that escaped the herbicide applications. No matter which of those herbicides you use pre-emergence, you're actually going to want to go through the field and scout carefully, because it's not only are you looking to check if your pre-emergent herbicide was activated properly, but it can also be important for checking for and for managing herbicide resistance in your weed populations. So scouting is very critical. So, in this case, you're going to want to start maybe a couple of weeks after your herbicide application and just look for those weeds that escaped.
Good advice right there. And if you'd like to see more producers on what she covered in the way of those herbicide categories and how those pre-emergents tend to work out there, why you can check out this article later on today in the Agronomy E-Update newsletter on considerations for pre-emergence herbicides for corn and soybean production. And we did want to mention as well something else in that same newsletter. What you've been doing lately, Sarah, is posting a weed of the month in the newsletter. And the one you've chosen this time around, it's always timely to talk about it in row crop weed control, and that is Palmer amaranth. And producers ought to be contemplating their control for that weed if they haven't done so already.
That's absolutely right, Eric. Palmer amaranth is amazing. We're checking some fields earlier this morning and found Palmer still alive and well in some of the clods that had been created when the field was cultivated. So it is definitely something that takes a lot of tactics to try to keep it successfully controlled.
And those tactics, and bringing that up because, as many a producer out there knows, unfortunately, Palmer amaranth has developed a keen resistance to quite a swath of commonly used herbicides. So when we talk management, what strategies are you proposing producers consider here?
Again, it's all about diversity and multiple approaches with Palmer and with a lot of weeds in general. So, Palmer is a really diverse weed, so it does have a high potential to develop resistance. And so the fewer times you use the same type of control practice, the less likely or the longer it's going to be before resistance develops. So practices like if you're in a system where tillage is appropriate for you, tillage can be helpful. Making sure that you are using good cultural practices, just doing things that are being a good agronomist and promoting very vigorous crop growth. And then when we start to think about herbicides, it's right rate, right time, and rotating and mixing herbicide modes of action. There's been some interesting modeling work done looking at how important it is that you actually mix those herbicide modes of action and then rotate that mixture in terms of slowing down the development of resistance.
And you note in the article that residual activity in the herbicide one uses is highly important for reining in Palmer amaranth.
Absolutely. So we talk about using those overlapping residuals or using residual herbicides in your post-emergent applications as well as the pre-emergent applications that we just discussed. That can be so important. My favorite pigweed is the one we never see, right? So keeping those pre-emergent herbicides out there in the field so that Palmer amaranth does not germinate and become a problem and potentially produce lots and lots of seeds. So, that question of activation, still applies when we talk about using those Group 15 products like Harness and Zidua and Dual in that post-emergent setting.
This is part of the series that Sarah has dubbed The World of Weeds. Palmer amaranth is in the spotlight this time around, and she has management considerations for this troublesome weed in that article at agronomy.ksu.edu, the e-update being posted later on today. So have a look at that, producers. And as always, Sarah, we appreciate the input. Thanks to you.
Thanks, Eric.
Weed Science Specialist with K-State Research and Extension. That's Sarah Lancaster on this part of Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
Coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today, and welcome back. Eric Atkinson with you, and with today's agricultural news headlines for you now, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, despite the escalation in rhetoric this week between U.S. and Chinese leaders on the coronavirus issue, work on implementing the Phase 1 trade agreement with China is continuing, with more actions relevant to agriculture announced this week. Here's more from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
More progress in getting more U.S. ag products into China. The U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative have just announced several new steps being taken by China to implement the Phase 1 trade agreement. First, China opening its markets to U.S. blueberries and California Hass avocados, also to U.S. barley for processing and to several forage products, including alfalfa hay pellets and cubes, almond meal pellets and cubes, and also Timothy hay. On another front, China has added to its list of U.S. facilities that will be eligible to send to China products like beef, pork, poultry, seafood, dairy, and infant formula. Total number of those various U.S. plants on the list, currently 2,085, the most ever. And on tariffs, China continuing its process of removing them on certain products in order to import more of them. In a statement, Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue said these actions will certainly help U.S. exporters expand sales in China. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
Yesterday, the USDA announced $1 billion in loan guarantees for rural businesses and farmers, and the department has also increased options for producers to defer loan payments to the Farm Service Agency. USDA's Rural Development has up to $1 billion now in loan guarantees for rural businesses to help with capital needs during the coronavirus pandemic, according to the department. And farmers who are also not eligible for traditional FSA loans could also be eligible for this new loan program. The program has specific requirements for using working capital that must be applied to prevent, prepare for, or respond to the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. According to the official statement, the loan application must be made through a traditional lending institution, such as a bank, a farm credit lender, or a credit union. The USDA has a long list, though, of what the funds cannot be used for, including agricultural production, though some exemptions do apply. These loan guarantees can go up to 90% of the total loan, the maximum term 10 years, though a loan recipient could pay interest-only payments for up to 3 years. For more details on that program, reach out to your local USDA Rural Development Office. And the FSA will also be expanding its disaster set-aside loan provision for farmers affected by COVID-19. That's typically used in the wake of natural disasters. The DSA will allow a producer to extend the payment on an FSA direct loan. Again, find out more about that through your local FSA personnel. Well, as promised, we bring you now this week's edition of the Kansas Wheat Scoop. And with that is Marcia Boswell. Marcia?
Kansas Wheat is estimating the wheat crop at 284.4 million bushels, 7% lower than the May 12th USDA estimate of 306 million bushels, and down 16% from last year's production. This estimate was released on May 21st, after yield calculations were made in hundreds of fields across the state by crop scouts, including extension agents, agronomists, and farmers. This estimate is a snapshot in time of the potential of the crop if weather conditions are favorable. Crop scouts stopped in wheat fields across the state over 3 days and calculated potential yields using a history-based formula provided by USDA NASS. The formula has traditionally been used by the Wheat Quality Council's Hard Red Winter Wheat Tour, which is held each year during the first week of May. This year's tour was canceled due to the COVID-19 pandemic, so a virtual tour was held the week of May 18th by Kansas Wheat and Kansas State University Research and Extension with support from the Kansas Department of Agriculture. This virtual tour gave a broad look at the crop in lieu of the regular tour. Day 1 covered north central and northwest Kansas. The north central district has been plagued by spring drought. Stripe rust is also becoming more prevalent, and barley yellow dwarf was found. The spring freeze also had a large effect on the crop in the area. The average yield for north central Kansas was 41.1 bushels per acre. The crop looked better in northwest Kansas, but was still variable. Jeannie Falk Jones, multi-county extension agronomist, said April took a toll on the wheat crop this year with all the cold temperatures. The average yield was 51.7 bushels per acre. Day 2 covered west central and southwest Kansas. Gary Miller-Shasky, a Kansas wheat commissioner from Lake, Kansas, reported that due to extreme fall and spring drought conditions, many acres of wheat have been abandoned. In addition, planted acres were already down significantly in the area. Miller-Shasky said, "I believe our quantity is going to be down a little bit, but I feel like our quality is going to be unbelievable." Calculated yield for west central Kansas was 42.5 bushels per acre, and southwest Kansas was 32.4. Day 3 covered south central, central, and eastern Kansas. The crop was much improved in these areas, however stripe rust is evident. Many fields have already been sprayed with a fungicide, but if not, rust will decrease yield potential. South central Kansas calculated yield was 49.5 bushels per acre. Central Kansas was 47.6, and eastern Kansas was 46.5. Overall crop yield potential for the state was estimated at 44.5 bushels per acre, 2.5 bushels lower than the USDA estimate of 47. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia, and do want to bring to your attention once again that K-State Research and Extension will be hosting its first ever live virtual wheat field day. That's coming up next Wednesday and Thursday evenings, the 27th and the 28th. It'll be live on YouTube to update you growers and others on the most recent crop advances and challenges. There'll be 2 field evenings beginning at 7 o'clock and concluding around 9 o'clock each evening. You're encouraged to attend one or both if you're so inclined. Covered there will be the state of the Kansas wheat crop, of course, and variety selection for different parts of Kansas. A look at diseases in the crop, selecting varieties with disease resistance in mind, and variety performance and selection for western, central, and eastern Kansas as well, and current and upcoming K-State varieties for western and central Kansas will be thoroughly covered, plus more. It's going to be an outstanding event. We hope you can take part and join in on not only the presentations but the discussion panels that will conclude each evening. If you'd like to know more about the virtual wheat field day over 2 evenings' time next Wednesday and Thursday, contact Romulo Lalato at lalato@ksu.edu. lalato@ksu.edu. This is Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so if you have a fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going in. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Closing out this Agriculture Today, it's our weekly get-together with K-State Research and Extension climatologist Mary Knapp, as she shares the latest on Kansas agricultural weather. Well, let's talk of what's happened the past 24 hours, Mary. Parts of western Kansas, so desperately in need of moisture, got that very thing yesterday and overnight, it sounds.
Right. There were quite a few stations that saw over a half an inch, which is just a drop in the bucket of what they needed, but there were other areas that had an inch. And again, this is the start of the unsettled weekend, so there is a potential for more to follow on with what they got. Not everyone saw those amounts out in the Southwest. You get down into Morton County, and the amounts were a lot lighter. Our weather station in Richfield only reported 0.09 of an inch. And it wasn't too heavy once you got a little bit further north. In Greeley County, again, less than 1/4 of an inch in those areas. So not everything that we need, but it's a nice start and certainly welcome after the long dry spell that they've had.
Now, when we're talking about that region of the state, northwest Kansas, you say, missed out on this go-round.
Yes, northwest Kansas was basically dry and saw very little out of the system. Again, there is that chance for most of the weekend for additional rains to fall, and hopefully they'll catch some of that. And we should also note that this system hasn't moved much. A lot of yesterday, it was parked over the central part of the state. It's begun to show a little bit more movement to the east, but still not a rapid mover. And so the eastern parts of the state didn't see those same high rainfall amounts either. Here in Manhattan, we had 0.06 of an inch, which is 1/10 of an inch less than what we would expect for just a single day at this time of the year.
But that may change in the next 48 hours plus, and we'll talk about that. The latest drought update, though, we should reference that because it's still a factor in western Kansas, irrespective of these recent rains.
Right. We do have a large area of extreme drought. That did not expand any. We were on the cusp of expanding it for the next week, and we'll see how these rains fall out as to whether or not that will expand. The expansion was in the northeast part of the state along the Nebraska border, adding it into the abnormally dry area. There was a little bit of contraction on the eastern edge in south central Kansas, where they'd seen substantial rains last week. And so that was basically where the change in the drought monitor went. The Climate Prediction Center has released the drought outlook for the summer months. Not surprising, they basically are calling for the drought to continue in the western areas of the state. Again, this is our heavy rainfall season, and even if we get rain, it will take substantial sustained rains for the drought to be erased. There is an area in west central Kansas where they do expect conditions to improve, but it may not be enough to totally erase the drought.
Well, temperatures, Mary, have settled into typical ranges for late spring and early summer in Kansas, and now we can watch those growing degree day figures that you post on the Weather Data Library's website. And what are they telling us?
Right. We're still behind where we should be at this time of the year, which, again, while the temperatures have been closer to seasonal, they still have been a little bit on the cool side, particularly in the central and eastern part of the state. The western areas where it has been drier and has had more sunshine, those growing degree days have accumulated a little bit more quickly. And producers that want to track that can go to the mesonet.ksu.edu, check the agricultural link on the option, and then you'll see the degree days there. We have it for corn, both short and long season sorghum, cotton, alfalfa weevils, just in case you're looking at the need to spray those. And there is a custom option so you can put in your own degree day formula if that's what you need.
It's a great informative resource, mesonet.ksu.edu. Well, more on this outlook for the rest of today, into the weekend, and throughout the Memorial Day holiday. It's going to be wet throughout the better part of Kansas, it sounds.
Yes, when we look at the quantitative precip forecast for the 3-day period, which it would cover this holiday weekend, we're looking at getting somewhere around 3/4 of an inch to as much as 1.75 inches. The highest amounts are expected along the Nebraska border in north central Kansas, and again, a small sliver of southeast Kansas, which can't seem to catch a break. They're always in the heavy rain event. But when you go along the Kansas-Colorado border, that's where the amounts start dropping off. And if you're down in Morton County again, they're looking at between 1/4 and 1/2 inch out of this system, which of course is way below what they would really need. But at least it's signaling a change, and we are getting something out of it. If we extend it out a little bit further and look at that 7-day total, which carries us to the end of May, actually the 29th of May, the amounts in central and eastern Kansas jumped considerably, and there's a widespread area of 2 to 4 inches of rain expected in that. Western Kansas, again, a little bit on the lighter side. Northwest Kansas may see 3/4 of an inch, move out a little bit into the Oakley area, and you're a little bit higher at the inch, maybe 1.25 inches. Again, that sliver of Morton County not expected to see a whole lot. They may see as much as a half, maybe even 3/4 of an inch, but again, a lot less than they need. And that dry spot carries into the Oklahoma Panhandle and into southeastern Colorado. So that's where they're going to be really missing out on it.
All right. And Mary, thanks so much. We will talk again next Friday. Enjoy your holiday weekend.
Thanks, Eric. And I'm hoping for some rain out in western Kansas.
Absolutely so. Mary Knapp, climatologist with K-State Research and Extension. And we'll be away on Monday for Memorial Day, so please rejoin us right here on Tuesday. Won't you? Until then, Eric Atkinson wishing you a good holiday weekend for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.